Welcome to the STEM lesson on chemical careers. I'm Mr. Rast, and this lesson is going to be about chemical warfare. And yes, there are careers in chemical warfare. In particular, in the military, it's more about protecting and identifying the chemicals that we may be potentially exposed to. I served in the United States Navy, and our policy when I was in the Navy, and who knows how things have changed, was that the United States reserves the right to retaliate with chemical weapons if we're attacked with them, but we're really not in the business of using chemical weapons in warfare. At least that's what it was back when I was serving in the military back in Desert Storm. So let's talk about this and the uniqueness of being on a military base. We're going to talk to some soldiers and airmen about their profession and what they use today, cutting edge kind of stuff. So let's talk about the lesson itself, though. We're going to break this apart into 3 different lessons. The first one, I'm going to talk about the history of chemical warfare. Then we're going to talk about the different agents in chemical warfare. That's the second one. And the third one, we're going to talk about the detection equipment and the protection and detection equipment. So this first one here is going to be the history. And the history is important because there is a long history of chemicals being used in warfare, and that is why there is a need for people to be trained in how to detect it and how to protect ourselves to detect and decontaminate if we do get exposed to chemical warfare. So that's the point of the history, is the fact that there's a long history of chemicals being used in warfare. So long time ago, or even early history, we find that chemical weapons, even crude ones that are using chemicals in war, can create panic and fear, give you a psychological edge on your opponent or your enemy. I found as early as 1000 BC, and again, you can research, you might find something even older than this, but what I found was at 1000 BC, there's evidence or documentation that arsenic smoke was used by the Chinese in warfare. So that's over 3,000 years ago that we have evidence that chemicals were being used in war. In 600 BC, Solon of Athens poisoned the drinking water of Kira. That would be considered chemical warfare. In the 1400s, Leonardo da Vinci designed a shipboard weapon that could fire arsenic-filled shells. So, and there's a picture, a Da Vinci illustration, and he came up with all these kinds of ideas, and some of them came true and some of them didn't, but just an amazing scientist. So the idea of chemical weapons has been around a long time, and this is an example of making chemical weapons even more effective, designing stuff like this. Not all chemical warfare comes from overseas. We did have a history in the Civil War that it's very, I'm glad this didn't happen. It could have happened, but it was actually a plan. So near the end of the Civil War, the Union planned to use hydrochloric acid and sulfuric acid clouds to clear the Confederate trenches. During the siege at Petersburg, the plan was not acted upon. And I'm very glad that this wasn't acted upon. It would be another dark spot in history for America to be one of the earliest countries to be using chemical weapons. So it was planned, though. It was planned. It just didn't act upon it. So they were actually in the process of this, and it's something that a lot of people don't realize about the Civil War. In World War I, this is where things really started to ramp up with chemical weapons. So in World War I, the horror of chemical weapons left the world reeling. The Geneva Convention made an attempt to severely limit their use in warfare. They restricted, because before the Geneva Convention, there was an unrestricted use of chemical agents that caused millions of casualties. So we didn't really have, to say that using chemical weapons is not fair, if you would. And so in World War I, they started introducing chemical weapons, and then each side started using more and more different types of agents to use on the battleground, and it caused 1 million casualties on both sides of World War I. In 1914, a German scientist Fritz Haber came up with the idea of creating a poisonous gas cloud using chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is relatively available. We use it in swimming pools so that we don't swim in a sea of bacteria, and we even use small concentrations of chlorine in our water to kill things. And in fact, chlorine has been one of the major factors in increasing the human lifespan because it kills bacteria and pathogens that will be found in your water. And so we can drink clean water, but it is a poison. It will kill things, but in small amounts. Really, the dose makes the poison. In small amounts, it will kill weaker things like the bacteria, but won't harm us. And it's actually increased our lifespan. So chlorine is very useful, but in higher concentrations, it will kill us. And so Fritz Haber came up with the idea of using chlorine in the battlefields to give a strategic advantage to the Germans. Now, chlorine is heavier than oxygen, so what happens if you release chlorine on the battlefield, it will seep into the trenches. In April 1915, the Germans deployed a chlorine attack against the French. So Fritz Haber came up with the idea, and they developed it within a year and deployed it when they invaded the French, when they attacked the French in April of 1915. And this is really the start of massive uses of chemical weapons in war. Later in 1915, the Allied troops made their own chlorine gas attacks. So it's not just the Germans, every side has blood on their hands in this situation. This led to a race for more toxic chemicals. The Germans came up with diphosgene gas, a more potent choking agent, and the French tried cyanide gas. So at this point here, to defend against these gases, gas masks started getting developed and used on the battlefield. In 1917, to go work around the idea of a gas mask, the Germans introduced mustard gas. And mustard gas will give chemical burns to exposed skin. So now the soldiers, if they have a gas mask, that's not quite enough, because now they have to cover their entire bodies.
Chemical weapons were by far the most insidious technology of the First World War.
Large-scale chemical warfare began in World War I, but the concept was around much, much earlier. Even during the American Civil War, there were concepts of employing a chlorine-type shell, but each time the concept was rejected because it was thought to be against warfare.
Germany had no such qualms during the First World War.
There was the 1899 Hague Convention that said you cannot use a shell that the sole purpose was to disseminate a toxic gas. So to get around that agreement, they mixed a high explosive with a chemical agent.
Early on, both sides attempted to lace grenades with non-lethal harassing agents, like tear gas. Tear gas is known as a lacrime, which means it irritates the tear ducts, causing them to tear and obstruct vision. But any chemical agent must gently saturate the air to be effective.
The first use of chemical warfare in World War I was tear gas. The Germans used it first, but the French didn't notice. I guess the wind was too high. The Germans then used it against the Russians, and it was too cold, the tear gas froze.
After these false steps, the German military intensified its efforts, developing lethal gas for use in mortar shells. It was aided by a chemist named Fritz Haber. Haber was a leading scientist and academic whose work in chemistry was world-renowned. A deeply patriotic Prussian, he pioneered the use of chlorine and later phosgene as a weapon.
Chlorine and phosgene are respiratory agents. They attack the lungs, and the victims wind up actually drowning in their own bodily fluids.
The Germans first used chlorine on the battlefield of Ypres, Belgium, in 1915, as they were attempting to push through the British and French lines. They waited until the wind was blowing toward the French to prevent any gas from floating back over their own troops.
The first attack was very psychologically effective in that the average French soldier did not know what to expect and saw this cloud coming towards them. At first they thought maybe the German trenches were on fire and there was just smoke. But once they smelled it and got gassed by it and got affected by it, the word spread very quickly.
Terrified soldiers fled to escape the sinister yellow cloud as it floated toward their position. The gas may have cost the British as many as 5,000 lives. But the Germans did not capitalize on their success because they failed to follow up on the attack. The Allies ultimately blocked their advance and pushed them back. Shortly after Ypres, both sides began hurling chemical agents at each other. It was a chemical arms race as each side attempted to develop more effective weapons. But launching enough poison to create a cloud sufficient to saturate the air to lethal levels was a technological challenge. 75 and 155 millimeter artillery shells were long range and carried a lot of agent into the trenches, but it could take hundreds of shells to create a cloud. Once again, chemist Fritz Haber offered his expertise.
Fritz Haber decided that one way was to simply use the chlorine in a chemical cylinder.
Attackers could launch 20 to 50 times more gas in the cylinder than they could inside the much smaller shell, which also had explosives taking up space inside it. Launching the cylinders was effective, but it was a clear violation of the Hague Convention. Clifford Holliday remembers the first time he was gassed during a battle.
It was a foggy night, and when they turned that gas loose, it just stayed right on the ground.
But by 1916, Holliday and his comrades were now equipped, however poorly, to counter the effects of the creeping gas cloud.
The first gas mask we had was a piece of square chamois cloth soaked in this chemical, and it was in a rubber-lined bag with a zipper on it, and when you were into that, you just hang it over your nose.
Ammonia and other chemicals in the cloth neutralized the acid passing through. Within a short time, however, defense technology improved, providing soldiers with masks that included charcoal filters, carried on the back, that neutralized the poison.
This is one of the later gas masks. The design had this hood that fit over the face, had the lenses that protected the eyes, and this hose which attached to a canister. This is the pack that carried it, and inside were a metal canister. The material that filtered the air was in this canister.
But the bulky gas mask seriously reduced a soldier's effectiveness, making it awkward to aim a gun. And filtering agents did nothing to protect against so-called mustard gas, which wasn't a gas at all, but a sticky, persistent liquid.
Mustard gas is a blister agent. It won't necessarily kill you, but it will rot your flesh, and it's also a pretty horrible thing.
After mustard gas was introduced in 1917, soldiers had to be covered in waterproof clothing that protected their skin. That prevented exposure to the non-lethal but extremely painful mustard agent. All of this was difficult on the troops, but gas technology didn't add up to much strategically. Gas played no decisive role in any battles of the First World War. Gas masks kept most from dying, and subject to meteorological whims, gas was simply too unreliable.
It just made everybody more miserable and had some casualties, but it was not decisive.
Though gas injured more than 1 million soldiers, it killed fewer than 100,000, representing less than 1% of the war's death toll. Germany's Fritz Haber is not listed among those 100,000, but it's hard not to think of him, the father of chemical weapons, as a victim of his own misguided patriotism.
His wife, who was also a chemist, was so horrified by what he did that she committed suicide. She couldn't live with it. And the ultimate irony was he was run out of Germany in 1933 when Hitler took over because he was Jewish, and the Germans had no use for him anymore.
So, quite ironic that Hitler takes over and forces the guy out that basically would do anything for his country. So it's a quite disturbing tale, Fritz Haber. This is a picture of a concentration camp, and in World War II, we see chemical agents being used again, except that the threat of retaliation generally kept nations from using chemical weapons against similarly armed nations. In other words, I'm less likely to attack you with chemical agents if I know you have chemical agents because I don't want to be attacked by them. So what we see in World War II is it didn't stop nations from using chemical weapons to attack other countries that were unable to respond with weapons of mass destruction. So, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. They ignored the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Protocol, and Italy sprayed mustard gas from airplanes during that invasion. Japan attacked Chinese troops with lewisite, which is a type of blister agent. We'll get into that later. And lewisite is named after the U.S. inventor Captain W. Lee Lewis that invented lewisite. And so the Japanese used this against the Chinese. And the Germans used cyanide-based gas to massacre Jewish civilians in concentration camps. So they would use cyanide to kill the Jewish civilians in their concentration camps by the hundreds and thousands. Next comes the Cold War, and during the Cold War, you have that political idea right now, like, I'm not going to attack you with a chemical weapon because you can attack me. But in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, enough weapons to destroy everybody in their country. So if we attacked them, we would be afraid that they would wipe out all of the Americans, and the same was true with the Soviets. They wouldn't attack America because they knew Americans could wipe out all of the Soviets. What happens next is, you know what, hey, what if we could figure out where those weapons silos are, and if we disable them, then we would be the ones that they couldn't retaliate. So to prevent that from happening, both sides started developing more weapons. If we create more weapons, then if we disable some or some don't work, we still have backup plans. And eventually, the Soviets and the United States could wipe out all humans on the planet multi-times over, and it came bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is why it's called the Cold War, because nobody ever used these weapons of mass destruction. But however, the chemical weapons, because when you have chemical weapons and you develop in a country, it poses a danger to the health and the environment of the nations that possess them. So having these things actually can cause some problems to the nations that have these chemical weapons. I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment. Anyways, in 1950s, the British and US researchers came up with VX. It's a nerve agent so toxic that a single drop on your skin can kill you in 15 minutes. In the 1980s and the 1990s, Soviet researchers developed Novichok agents that are a new and highly lethal nerve agent. And I hope I'm saying that properly. If I'm not, I don't hear people say this out loud very often. So Novichok agents was a Soviet nerve agent. And in comparison to VX, it's highly lethal, and VX will one drop on your skin can kill you in 15 minutes. Novichok is even stronger, so that means even smaller amounts can do more damage to you than that, which is crazy. And this is what I mean about this race for creating more and more dangerous things. The U.S. explored the use of psychedelic agents such as BZ to incapacitate enemy troops. And when I get into topics of agents, I will talk about BZ more. So the United States started talking about using incapacitating agents. And the idea there is that if you put it on the enemy will be unable to fight back. And the moral humanitarian idea of, I guess, of using an incapacitating agent is collateral damage. If it gets on other people, they're just incapacitated. You're not killing and scarring the other people so much. In 1967, the Egyptians used nerve agents against civilians in the Yemen Civil War. So you see these weapons are starting to be used, although the Soviets and the United States weren't using each other for fear of retaliation. And you see countries using it against other countries that can't fight back, just like the Italians using it in World War II against the Ethiopians. In 1968, thousands of sheep die in Utah as weapon facilities allegedly leaks nerve agent, but the findings were not definite. So this is what I mean about having chemical weapons poses a threat to the environment and your own nation, because just having nerve agent, if it leaks out like it did in 1968, it killed thousands of sheep. Now, I would assume this facility was put far away from human population because it is so dangerous. But I don't know, it's scary stuff. In 1982, Laos and Vietnam used chemical weapons in the Laos-Cambodia battles. And finally, in 1982, the Soviets used chemical weapons, including nerve agent, in their invasion of Afghanistan. And instead of coming to the aid of Afghanistan and sending troops, we sent weapons because we didn't want to have a conflict with the Soviet Union. We didn't want to start World War III because, like I said, we both had such firepower, we were afraid of it. So even though the Soviets broke the Geneva Convention in this invasion, all we did was supply weapons to the Afghanis to help defend themselves. Chemical warfare in the Iran-Iraq war. Nations that have developed chemical weapons tend to use them during armed conflicts unless they fear overwhelming reprisal. So like I said, they tend to use them unless they think the other country can attack back with this. Libya used chemical weapons obtained from Iran and attacks against neighboring Chad. So even though we have these rules, even though we have these, the Geneva Convention, even though we say you shouldn't do this, historically we see that these weapons keep getting used. And that's the point I'm trying to drive across with you right here.
Our first view of Halabja. We are shocked to find that it looks as if the Iraqi bombing happened yesterday. A new mosque is the only sign of reconstruction. Ten years ago, the people of Halabja were on the front line of the Iran-Iraq war. Despite the fighting, they lived normal daily lives, unaware that they would be used as guinea pigs by Saddam Hussein. Then in March 1988, the Iraqis launched a chemical attack. They used cyanide, mustard gas, and the nerve agents sarin, taboon, and VX, the very chemical weapons now being hidden by Saddam Hussein.
We started to feel very hot. Our bodies were shaking. We put wet clothes on our faces and went up on the roof. We saw people desperately escaping in all directions. We were so terrified we stayed on the roof. We couldn't move. We started to vomit. Many people were collapsing around us and dying. The gas smelled of garlic and rotten apples. This is the house of my neighbor, Nauros, who used to run the tea shop in Halabja. All 8 members of his family were killed. Afterwards, he went crazy because of the gas. He killed himself with a knife.
Over 3 days, wave after wave of bombers attacked the town with poison gas. During the attack, many people hid in their cellars, but found no protection as the gas seeped into their hiding places.
"155 people died here. I was walking on bodies. There were bodies of children, women, old people all around. My wife died over there, right here on the step.
For this man, the tragedy has no end. His daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, survived, but has been driven out of her mind.
She cannot speak and she cannot respond our questions. Just stay in the bed, inside the house. I think that pattern may be something like manic depressive psychosis in psychiatry. We have no psychiatrist here.
News of our arrival spreads quickly. It's the first time that a top Western medical specialist has come to Alabja, and hundreds turn up.
We don't want to miss anybody out, no matter how young or how old, even if their relatives have died and they are anxious about them, themselves, and their relatives. We're trying to collect all of that data.
So this event. This is when I was in the military. What I was dealing with. This was what started Desert Storm, the war that I was in. I was in the Navy, and so we were in the Persian Gulf for all this kind of situation. It's a very, very, very sad situation what happened here. So today, though, we see chemical weapons. The biggest threat we see coming from terrorists. Terror groups find chemical weapons suited for their purpose. And the reason I say this is because terrorists aren't trying to kill one person. They want to kill a lot of people, and they want to create a lot of fear, and they want to make you do something or stop doing things that you would normally do. And so if, you know, they don't care if they blow up babies and children and the elderly or women. They're trying to create fear and hurt as many people as possible. So chemical weapons is ideal for them. However, it's difficult in obtaining the materials, preparing the weapons, and delivering the attacks. So because of this, it has had limited number of casualties historically. So let's talk about some of the history behind chemical weapons and terrorism. And this is a good story. I got a couple good stories I'll start off with first. So in 1974, a Yugoslavian immigrant, oh, I can't say this name, Muhamrin Kubrakovic, I don't know. I'm sorry, my apologies. He was caught before he launched an attack on an airport. Police found 20 pounds of cyanide hidden in his apartment. So because he was stockpiling, it got some attention by the intelligence agencies, and they were able to stop him with 20 pounds of cyanide gas. Remember, this is a gas, 20 pounds of gas. This is a ridiculous amount. And he was going to attack an airport with it, which is strategically very strategic in chemical weapons, because what we learned about when the Germans used chlorine, often the attacks, it would disseminate in the air, but if you attack an airport, an enclosed building, it's not going to disseminate as much, and so it's going to cause a lot more fatalities with this. But this was stopped. Good news. Another one that was stopped was in 1984. Federal agents raided an armed camp ran by the white supremacist group called the Covenant, the Sword, the Arm of the Lord. When they raided this camp, they found 30 gallons of potassium cyanide. So think of a gallon of milk, right? 30 gallons filled with nothing but potassium cyanide. So another good situation here. Unfortunately, in Japan in 1994, we have a not so good situation. The Shiriko cult released nerve agent, killing 7 people and injuring 500 more in just a test run for a later attack. That later attack occurred in 1995, where the Shiriko cult released nerve agent in a Tokyo subway, killing 12 people and injuring thousands.
What would happen if terrorists got their hands on a weapon of mass destruction? This is one of the most terrifying scenarios that people can imagine. But it isn't an idle fear. It actually happened in 1995. I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the sarin gas attack that the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo launched in the Tokyo subway system on March 20th, 1995. Aum Shinrikyo, which translates as Supreme Truth, was a religious cult started in 1984 by Shoko Asahara. He had lost most of his sight as a child, and as a young adult he studied various strains of Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. These studies eventually convinced him of two things: that he was the first enlightened one to appear on earth since Buddha, and that the end of the world was near. Asahara targeted his pitch at disillusioned young people. He was a good recruiter. By 1995, Aum Shinrikyo had as many as 40,000 followers. Just as important, Aum Shinrikyo grew rich. By the early 1990s, it had more than $300 million in assets. How did the cult get so wealthy? Partly by running businesses, and partly by requiring members to sign their wealth over to the cult. Aum Shinrikyo's deep pockets enabled it to secretly master the difficult task of making sarin. First created in the 1930s by Nazi scientists looking for better pesticides, sarin is a deadly nerve agent. It kills by disrupting the ability of nerves to communicate with the rest of the body. Sarin is so toxic that inhaling a single drop can be lethal. During the rush hour on the morning of March 20th, 1995, 5 Aum Shinrikyo agents put a liquid form of sarin into packages made to look like lunch boxes and bottled drinks. Perhaps they were driven by the belief that the apocalypse was beginning. Or perhaps they wanted to punish Japan because police were about to raid Aum Shinrikyo's offices. Whatever their motives, the Aum Shinrikyo agents boarded 3 subway lines, punctured their packages with umbrellas, and walked away. The liquid sarin leaked out and turned into gas. The results were horrific. Within minutes, commuters lay on the ground gasping for air, blood pouring from their noses and mouths. Said one survivor of the attacks, "Hell describes it perfectly." 12 people died that day. 4,000 to 6,000 more were injured. The death toll would have been many times higher had Aum Shinrikyo succeeded in creating a more effective way to disperse the deadly sarin gas. Japanese officials discovered after the attack that Aum Shinrikyo had been experimenting for years with chemical and biological weapons. Indeed, the cult had carried out at least 9 biological attacks. They had all failed because the cult hadn't found an effective way to spread the biological agents. And Aum Shinrikyo had used sarin gas at least once before, in a previously unexplained incident that killed 7 people in a Tokyo neighborhood. Asahara and his accomplices were charged with murder. In 2004, they were sentenced to death by hanging. Asahara exhausted his legal appeals in 2006. He now awaits execution. What is the lesson of Aum Shinrikyo's sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system? Just this: technology makes it possible for groups and individuals to carry out the kinds of attacks that once only governments could undertake. If anything, advances in technology are making it easier for terrorists to contemplate using weapons of mass destruction. The internet makes it far easier to find and share information. Cheaper, more powerful computers and better scientific instruments make it possible for people with basic skills to accomplish things that once required sophisticated laboratories and teams of highly trained, highly skilled scientists. These concerns lie at the heart of the current dispute over news that scientists have discovered a way to transform the H5N1 bird flu virus into a form that could cause a deadly human pandemic. Many scientists worry that this work could eventually be duplicated by less skilled individuals intent on doing harm. Such debates are only going to grow more and more heated in the years to come as technological advances make it possible to do more and more with less and less training. So here is a question to consider. What steps should society take to protect itself as technological developments make it easier for terrorists, messianic figures, or just embittered individuals to inflict great harm? I encourage you to weigh in with your answers on my blog, The Water's Edge. You can find it at cfr.org. I'm Jim Lindsay. Thank you for watching this installment of Lessons Learned.